They asked me once how many Germans I'd killed, and I told them I didn't know, but I remember exactly how many of our own wounded I couldn't save. 17. 17 men calling for their mothers in the dark while we held that bridge, waiting for armor support that was apparently being redirected to exploit a breakthrough opportunity. That's what the dispatch said. Breakthrough opportunity. The dispatch came from Patton's headquarters, 40 kilometers south, where the fighting had already stopped. We didn't know that then. We just knew the morphine was gone, and the kid from Manchester, Davies, his name was Davies, he was asking me if his legs were still attached. They weren't. And when the photographers arrived the next morning, stepping over bloodstains that hadn't dried yet, asking us to look victorious for a picture that would run beside Patton's quotes about aggressive armored warfare, Montgomery was standing behind them, silent, until he wasn't. This was early March 1945. We were somewhere between the Ruhr and the Rhine, in that stretch of German territory that doesn't look like much on a map, but cost us everything to cross. The 53rd Welsh Division, though I was English myself, attached to a reconnaissance section because I could read German, and somebody thought that might be useful. Turns out the most useful skill in that country was knowing how to tell a boy his legs were gone while lying convincingly enough that he'd stop screaming. Montgomery's 21st Army Group was pushing toward the Rhine, methodical as always, grinding through every fortified village and every rear guard position the Germans left behind. Patton's Third Army was further south, moving faster, making headlines. The newspapers loved Patton. He gave them quotes about blood and guts and killing. Montgomery gave them timetables and logistics reports. You can guess which one sold more papers back home. We'd been in contact for 3 weeks straight by then. Not the kind of fighting that makes the news reels, no tank battles or paratroop drops. Just the slow, miserable work of clearing out an enemy who knew the ground better than we did and wasn't in any hurry to die. The weather was savage. Freezing rain that turned everything to mud, skies so low and gray you couldn't tell where the clouds ended and the smoke began. Our boots were rotting off our feet. We slept in shifts in foxholes that filled with water faster than we could bail them out. The smell of that place, I can still call it up if I close my eyes. Wet wool and cordite, latrines we couldn't dig proper in the saturated ground, and that particular smell of buildings that had been shelled, plaster dust and burned wood and something else, something sweet and wrong that you learned not to think about. We moved through villages that were just names on a map and rubble on the ground. Rothweiler, Kempenfeld, places that probably had bakeries and schools once. We fought the Germans for the ruins, and then we moved on and left them behind. The rumors started coming down around the 28th of February. Something big being planned. Officers getting tight-lipped, studying maps they wouldn't show us. Word was Montgomery was planning a major crossing of the Rhine, set-piece battle, thousands of men, the whole show. We'd be part of the preliminary work, clearing the approaches, securing the jumping-off points. Standard stuff. Dangerous but standard. Then we started hearing about Patton. Third Army's moving fast. Americans are already across somewhere down south. They're racing for Berlin while we're still mucking about in the mud. That sort of talk. The kind that builds resentment, makes men wonder why they're the ones getting shot at while someone else gets the glory. Our orders came through on the last day of February. Clear a cluster of fortified farms and a small village. Rothweiler, they called it. though I doubt it's on any map you'd find now. Secure the northern approach to a bridge site. Intelligence said light resistance. Retreating Wehrmacht. Maybe some old men from the Volkssturm. Should be straightforward. Sergeant Holloway laughed when he heard that. He'd been with the division since North Africa, survived more straightforward operations than most men get through in 3 wars. He had a way of laughing that let you know the joke wasn't funny. "Another lovely country walk," he said, checking his Sten gun for the 100th time, "just like they promised at Caen." Davies was with us by then, young replacement from Manchester, 18 years old, and trying hard not to show he was terrified. He'd been asking too many questions, the way new boys do. Where do I fill my canteen? What's the password? Should I fix bayonet now, or wait? Macready, our Bren gunner, finally told him to shut up and save his energy for carrying ammunition. Macready was a Scot, tough as stone, but he'd gone quiet since his mate caught a shell fragment the week before. Just did his job. Didn't talk unless he had to. Lieutenant Ashford led the section. School teacher before the war. Grammar school in Essex. He had this habit of studying every German document we found, reading them like they were exam papers, making notes in a little book he kept in his tunic pocket. He spoke German better than I did, but he never talked about where he'd learned it. We moved out at first light on the 1st of March. Cold dawn, mist hanging in the fields, that particular quality of silence you get before contact when every man is listening for the sound that means it's starting. You could hear the distant artillery, always the distant artillery, like thunder that never quite arrives. The creak of equipment, boots sucking in the mud, someone's canteen rattling because he hadn't secured it properly. The terrain was all low ridges and farm fields, everything brown and dead, studded with shell craters that had filled with water. The farms we were heading for sat on a slight rise, stone, buildings with thick walls, the kind German farmers had been building for centuries without knowing they'd make perfect defensive positions. The village was beyond them, church tower still standing. We could see it against the gray sky like a broken finger pointing at God. First shots came from a direction we weren't expecting, a machine gun, probably an MG-42 from the sound, that ripping cloth noise that means someone's about to die. We went down hard, scrambling for whatever cover we could find. The intelligence had been wrong. These weren't retreating troops. These were prepared positions, mutually supporting, waiting for us. Lieutenant Ashford was shouting for the Bren gun, trying to spot the firing position. Macready was already setting up, but you could see it in his face. We were caught in the open, and there were more guns than just the one we'd heard. The farms were arranged in a network, each one covering the approaches to the others. Someone had planned this, thought it through, turned those old stone buildings into a killing ground. We attacked because there wasn't anything else to do. You can't stay pinned in the open, and you can't go back. Not when the orders say take the position and the whole division's schedule depends on you taking it. So you get up and you run and you try not to think about the odds. The artillery support we'd been promised was thin. Shells were being conserved for the big push, the Rhine crossing, the operation that would matter in the history books. We got a few rounds on the nearest farm, enough to raise dust and make noise. Then we were on our own. The fighting was close and personal, the kind where you're clearing rooms and every door might hide a grenade trap, every pile of rubble might conceal a rifleman. The Bren gun jammed, mud in the mechanism, and I watched Macready clear it with frozen fingers while rounds cracked past his head, hitting the wall behind him, sending up puffs of stone dust. His hands were shaking, but they kept working, methodical, the way you do when your life depends on it. Davies got hit in the first hour. We were crossing between buildings and the MG-42 opened up again, that terrible sound, and Davies went down like someone had cut his strings. I got to him first. His legs were a mess, both of them, blood soaking through his trousers faster than I could think. He was conscious, looking up at me with these wide eyes, asking the question I knew was coming. "Are they still there?" he said. "My legs, I can't feel them. Are they there?" I gave him morphine. We still had some then, and I lied to him the way you're supposed to lie. Told him he'd be fine, just some fragments. Medics would patch him up good as new. He believed me because he wanted to believe me, because he was 18 years old and he wasn't ready to understand what his body already knew. We got him to cover, but there wasn't anywhere to evacuate him to. The aid station was back with the main column, and we were cut off, pinned down, fighting for every room in every building. So Davies lay there with the morphine wearing off, and I tried not to listen to him calling for his mother. Sergeant Holloway took 3 men and went to flank one of the farms, disappeared into the smoke and dust from our own grenades. I didn't see what happened to him then. I found out later, after it was done. We ended up in a farmhouse, 6 of us, surrounded. German voices outside shouting to each other, coordinating. The house was stone, walls thick enough to stop rifle rounds, but they had grenades and time, and they knew it. The room we were in still had furniture, broken chair in the corner, table on its side, family photographs on the wall, faces looking out at us from before the war, before any of this mattered. There was a child's toy on the floor, little wooden horse. I remember wondering what had happened to the family, if they'd left, or if they were in the cellar, or if they were past caring. That's when Holloway made his stand. He was holding the main door, keeping them from rushing us while we looked for a way out. Someone found a root cellar entrance, old storm cellar probably, opening into darkness that smelled like earth and turnips and gunpowder from the rounds we'd stored there. We started going down one by one, and Holloway stayed at the door. I heard the grenade hit the floor, that metal clink sound that stops your heart. Holloway kicked it back out. I saw him do it, saw his boot connect, saw it tumble back through the doorway. Then he pulled the door shut and held it. The explosion came through the walls, dust and smoke, and when it cleared, the door was gone, and so was Holloway. We ran through that cellar like rats, came out 100 yards away in a drainage ditch, and we didn't stop until we were back with what was left of the company. Took us 3 more days to secure those farms in the village. 3 days of the same grinding house-to-house fighting, losing men to positions we'd thought were clear, finding them occupied again after we'd moved on. By the time we finished, we'd taken 38 dead and 60 wounded from the battalion. The objectives were secure, but we were hollow, moving on automatic, doing the jobs we'd been trained to do because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant breaking. The morphine ran out on the 2nd day. After that, you just did what you could and tried not to hear the screaming. On the 4th of March, it was over. The Germans pulled back, not because we'd beaten them, but because they were done with us. I found their orders in the village, in a basement they'd been using as a command post. German logistics reports, withdrawal order, dated 4 days before we'd even arrived. It was all planned, all part of a larger pullback to the Rhine. They delayed us exactly as long as they needed to, let us pay in blood for every hour while their main forces escaped across the river. We didn't break them. They left when they were ready, and we'd spent 38 lives buying them the time they needed. The morning of the 5th was clear. First time in weeks the sun came through, made everything look almost clean, almost normal, except for the bodies waiting for graves registration and the blood in the streets that hadn't dried yet. We were sitting against a wall, too tired to move, sharing the last of someone's cigarettes, when the convoy arrived. American vehicles, press officers, photographers, some staff officers I didn't recognize. They were looking for something, asking questions, talking about Patton's breakthrough and Third Army's advance. We just stared at them. This was British sector, always had been. But they had their story, and they needed pictures for it. One of the photographers wanted us to look victorious. Actually said that. "Look victorious, lads." We were covered in mud and blood, some of it ours, some of it not. Davies was in the aid station tent screaming because the morphine was gone, and this man wanted us to smile for a picture that would run in stars and stripes next to quotes about aggressive armored warfare. An American staff officer was describing the action to a correspondent, using words like exploitation and rapid maneuver. There hadn't been any tanks here. There hadn't been any maneuver. There'd been men dying in rooms that smelled like cordite and fear, and the only thing rapid about it was how fast you could bleed out when the morphine was gone. Lieutenant Ashford tried to correct him, politely, the way a school teacher corrects a student. He had the German withdrawal order in his hand, was trying to explain what had actually happened. The staff officer smiled and nodded and ignored every word. Then Montgomery arrived. We weren't expecting him. He was making rounds of forward units, checking positions for the Rhine assault, the big operation that would vindicate all of this, make sense of every life we'd spent. His convoy came up quiet, just a few vehicles, no ceremony. He got out and walked through the village, looked at everything the way he always did, methodical, noting details, missing nothing. He saw the aid station. He saw the rows of bodies. He stopped at the German command post, read the documents Lieutenant Ashford had found, the withdrawal order, the logistics reports. He didn't say anything, just read, his face giving nothing away behind those wire-rimmed spectacles. The American press officers intercepted him near the church. One of them asked about General Patton's success in this sector, whether Montgomery could comment on the breakthrough, the aggressive tactics that had collapsed German resistance. Montgomery went very still. He looked at the man asking the question, then at the bloodstains on the ground, then at those bodies waiting for burial. The German withdrawal order was in his hand, that piece of paper that proved everything about what had really happened here. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, cold, precise. "This action," he said, "was conducted by the 53rd Welsh Division, specifically the 158th Brigade and attached reconnaissance elements. It occurred on the 1st through 4th of March in the village of Rothweiler and surrounding farms. The casualties were 38 killed and 62 wounded. General Patton was at his headquarters in Nancy, approximately 40 kilometers from this position, during the entire action. The German forces withdrew according to a pre-planned schedule dated 26 February, 4 days before contact was made. There was no breakthrough. There was no collapse. There was a fighting withdrawal by a competent enemy against soldiers who did their duty and paid for it. If you wish to write about armored exploitation, I suggest you find an action where armor was actually present." He said it once, didn't raise his voice, didn't repeat himself, just stated the facts, named the units, honored the dead. Then he got back in his vehicle and drove on to the next position. The press officers left shortly after. The story that ran in the papers made no mention of Montgomery's statement. The headlines celebrated Patton's Third Army breakthrough, his tactical genius, his aggressive leadership. British casualties were mentioned in a single line, if at all. The village wasn't named. The action was described as occurring in Third Army's zone of advance. We were pulled back for 2 weeks, given replacements who didn't know Holloway's name or why McCready wouldn't talk. By the time we went back into action for the real Rhine crossing on the 23rd of March, the preliminary work had been forgotten, buried under the success of the massive operation that followed. The crossing succeeded. Montgomery's meticulous planning, his overwhelming force, his refusal to move until every detail was perfect. It worked. Thousands of men crossed the Rhine with fewer casualties than we'd taken at Rothweiler. The operation would be studied in military schools, analyzed in histories, remembered as a triumph of careful staff work over German desperation. Nobody remembers the village. Nobody remembers the 3 days in March when we spent 38 lives to buy time for an enemy withdrawal. McCready was killed in the Rhine crossing April 24th. Davies lost both legs, went back to England, and I lost track of him after the war. Lieutenant Ashford survived, went back to teaching, never spoke publicly about any of it as far as I know. I found out years later that Montgomery's statement had been classified, kept quiet to preserve Allied unity, to avoid damaging the relationship between British and American commands. I understand why they did it. We needed to win the war, and that meant staying together, presenting a united front. Patton was a fighting general, and men like him won wars. You don't win wars by arguing about who gets credit. But I was there, and I know what happened, and I know what Montgomery said when he looked at those bodies and heard someone trying to claim credit for their deaths. I'm not telling you this because I'm angry. Patton's dead now, Montgomery's dead, all the generals who argued about boundaries and credit and newspaper headlines, they're all gone. The war's been over for decades. The arguments don't matter anymore. I'm telling you because someone should remember what actually happened. Not for glory. There wasn't any glory in that village, not to settle scores that don't matter now. I'm telling you because Sergeant Holloway deserves to be remembered as more than a casualty statistic in someone else's victory. Because Davies should be more than a name on a list. Because the 17 men I couldn't save shouldn't disappear into a footnote about preliminary operations. What Montgomery said wasn't grand or memorable, not the kind of quote that makes it into the history books. It was just accurate, just true. He listed the units, named the casualties, stated the facts. He pointed out that claiming credit for something you weren't present for isn't leadership. They classified it, kept it quiet. And maybe that was necessary. I wasn't there to make those decisions. But someone should know. Someone should remember that we were there, that we did what was asked of us, that we paid the price. I've walked past monuments with Patton's name on them, never seen one for Rothweiler for those 3 days in March. And I suppose that's how it is. History remembers the drama, forgets the details, builds monuments to the men who gave good quotes instead of the men who held the line. But I was there, and I remember. The weight of Davies asking about his legs, the sound of that grenade Holloway kicked back through the door, the German family photograph on that wall, Montgomery's face when he looked at those bodies and heard that question about Patton's breakthrough, and now you know too. That's all I've got to say about what Montgomery said when Patton took credit for his victory. It wasn't much, but it was the truth, and sometimes that's all you've got left to hold on to.